Happening with Quebec and COVID. We're going to pivot over to the U.S. State Department because of the situation, the crisis in East Ukraine. Let's listen in right now.
With our allies and partners, including those in the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, and Australia. Our German allies, yesterday, took resolute action to ensure that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, what had been a prized $11 billion investment on the part of the Russian Federation, is suspended indefinitely. And as you have just seen, President Biden today authorized sanctions on Nord Stream 2 AG and its corporate office holders. We have now taken complementary action using our own authorities to ensure that Nord Stream 2 is off the table, just as we said it would be. In lockstep with our allies, we are blocking from the global financial system two large banks that are connected to the Kremlin and Russian military. And Russian sovereign wealth can no longer trade on U.S. or European financial markets. As you all know, we additionally sanctioned Russian elites, those elites who are, in many ways, complicit. This is the beginning of our response. If Putin escalates further, we will escalate further using additional sanctions and export controls, which we've yet to unveil, but are fully prepared to implement with allies and partners across the globe. The sequence of events that Secretary Blinken laid out at the UN Security Council last week appears to be proceeding exactly as he laid out. We've seen false flags. We've seen provocations. We've seen theatrically staged meetings at the Kremlin. We've seen cyber operations, and the list goes on. So where do we go from here? Moscow needs to demonstrate that it's serious about diplomacy. Russia's actions over the last 48 hours have, in fact, demonstrated the opposite. If Moscow's approach changes, we remain ready to engage. The United States and our allies and partners remain open to diplomacy. We are eager to engage to avert what would be a brutal and costly conflict. But, as we have said, diplomacy cannot succeed unless Russia changes course. As we have said, we are prepared. We are prepared for any contingency going forward. Matt.
Okay. Thanks. I have a question about the Houthi sanctions, but it's largely semantic, so I'll leave it till later. On Nord Stream 2, you guys have been saying for months, indeed for over a year, since the waivers were first granted, that in fact this gave you additional leverage, withholding the sanctions did, and would serve as a deterrent. Clearly, it didn't. They didn't provide you with any leverage at all that we can tell, because of what you just said in your opening statement about the invasion beginning. So, you know, how do you explain to people why you didn't impose these sanctions earlier?
So, Matt, it's important, and let's just rewind the tape and remember what has happened in recent hours. Yesterday, within a short time frame of the Russian invasion beginning, Germany took decisive, resolute action to take Nord Stream 2 off the table. Today, we followed with our own complementary authorities using the powers and capabilities that we have. We have always said, in the context of Nord Stream 2, in the context of the steps that we are taking with partners and allies around the world, that one of the most important tools we have in our arsenal is transatlantic unity. The fact that Germany acted so quickly, so decisively, is in many ways a product of the coordination, of the consultation we have done now with two successive German governments. Of course, it started with Chancellor Merkel and her government, and in more recent months we have had concerted discussions with Chancellor Scholz and his government. The fact that we are acting in unison immediately to take these steps that essentially remove Nord Stream 2 from the equation, that is a byproduct, that is a result of the work that we have done together with the German government over the course of these last several months, over the course of the last year or so.
So it sounds to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that your argument is that if you had imposed the sanctions earlier, the Germans wouldn't have the Germans wouldn't have done what they did yesterday, or it would have been a much bigger lift to get them to do that.
What we have said, and our strategy has been predicated on the knowledge that transatlantic unity is the most powerful instrument we have.
But I don't. But look, the pipeline's already been built. Okay. Now, whether it gets turned on or not, is another question.
Right. So
presumably you had more leverage, and I don't understand why you don't think that you would have had more leverage if these sanctions had been imposed before the pipeline was finished.
So, Matt, you also raise a good point. The pipeline, when this administration came into office, was more than 90% complete. We have imposed sanctions under PISA on a number of targets associated with this pipeline, persons and entities. But the fact is that had we sanctioned Nord Stream 2 AG, had we sanctioned its corporate office holders, it is far from clear that that would have kept the pipeline from going into operation. What the Germans did yesterday was to ensure that the pipeline is no longer part of the equation. Right. So by acting together with the Germans, how we did, when we did, and the way in which we did, we have ensured that this is an $11 billion prize investment that is now a hunk of steel sitting at the bottom of the sea.
All right. Well, I don't think you though can prove, and the converse can't be proven either. But you just don't know if imposing the sanctions earlier would have had more of a deterrent effect, or any deterrent
well,
effect.
If we would have made it a sunk cost many months ago for the Russian Federation, I don't think that would have had much deterrent capability.
Well, but it hasn't anyway. So I'll leave it there.
Simon.
Yeah, the Secretary obviously said yesterday he had cancelled his meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov, but you guys remain open to diplomacy. So what exactly would you want to see from Russia in order to, reschedule that meeting, in order to resume some kind of diplomacy, diplomatic talks between you? And just an additional one. You've sort of, this is the last, or this is part of the first tranche of sanctions, the Nord Stream 2 sanctions that just came out. Is that the end of the first tranche, or is there more coming in that? And can you say whether more sanctions actions will be taken if Russia, doesn't escalate further from where it is now?
Well, the question you ask is what we would like to see. Let me start by answering that question by letting you know what we no longer will engage in, and that is the pretense of diplomacy. You heard the Secretary use that phrase yesterday, and that is what we have seen. This is, and has been, in some ways, diplomatic kabuki theater on the part of the Russians, making statements that they are committed to a diplomatic path, while their actions suggest exactly the opposite. That is not an environment in which diplomacy can achieve the results that it needs to achieve. Our goal here, even as the Russian invasion of Ukraine is beginning, is to avert the worst case scenario that we have warned about for some time now. And we have gone into great detail in terms of what that could look like. Electronic warfare, a fuller scale invasion, an attack on major urban centers, including Kyiv, a city of 2.9 million people, horrific human rights abuses, atrocities, potential war crimes. These are all things that, even as the invasion is beginning, we are going to do everything that we reasonably can to prevent from happening. And so that's why, together with our allies and partners, we absolutely remain open to diplomacy, but only if Moscow is serious. We are not going to engage in this pretense with them, during which they draw out the process, suggest one thing, do another, ready their preparations, move their forces closer to the border, develop and refine their plans as they give the world a head fake that they are actually committed to the diplomatic path. Now, there are a number of ways that Moscow could indicate that it is serious. It essentially boils down to de-escalation. That would be the most concrete the clearest indication that diplomacy has the potential to bear fruit, that diplomacy has the potential to save lives. That is the kind of diplomacy we are interested in. That is also not the kind of diplomacy that we have seen any indication as of yet that Moscow is interested in. Vivian.
Can you comment on the reports that the U.S. informed the Ukrainian government that an attack could happen as soon as tonight, and that Kharkiv is possibly in the line of attack, that it could be directly that the Russian troops could roll over the border and attack Kharkiv tonight?
What I'll say about those reports is they are entirely consistent with what we have been saying for some time now, that Russia has amassed forces along Ukraine's borders, in Belarus, positioned the assets, the heavy weaponry, the soldiers, the service members it would need to undertake an invasion of Ukraine at a moment's notice. That has been true for some time now. So for several days now, we have said the invasion is potentially imminent, meaning it could start today, it could start tomorrow, it could start next week. What we haven't seen is, and this goes back to Simon's question, is any indication that the Russians are backing away from this. We have not seen any data points that alleviate the grave concern, the profound concern that we've been expressing for some time now. So the invasion remains potentially imminent, and Moscow is poised to do precisely the kinds of things that you just outlined.
Can I just follow up really quickly also on something Simon said, that you and Simon discussed? You know, with this notion of diplomacy still on the table, and now you're saying that it's possible that, Donbass is obviously being attacked, if not actually, then rhetorically, that the Russians are now, acknowledging or recognizing their autonomy and sovereignty. So how can you then justify discussions about diplomacy when this is underway? I mean, you keep on saying that the Russians have to show that they're serious, they have to de-escalate, but could they pause things right now and possibly engage in talks with the U.S., or do significant sort of scale back have to happen? Do we have to see troops falling back before that's discussed? Is Donbass being regarded differently from the rest of the country?
So you heard from our colleagues at the White House and others here over the course of the day yesterday, including the Secretary, that the invasion is beginning. And when we spoke about the beginning of the invasion, we talked about several developments over the course of that 24-hour period. Vladimir Putin's recognition of the so-called DNR and LNR, the order that he conveyed to the Ministry of Defense to deploy forces into the Donbass, the authorization that he sought to send Russian service members into service extraterritorially, the rhetorical assault, essentially, that we saw President Putin deliver against Ukraine, denying Ukraine its sovereignty and essentially its right to exist. Those are what we've seen, those are what we've heard. But as I just mentioned, there are some things, many things in fact, that Russia is poised to do at a moment's notice that we have not yet seen. A large-scale invasion, an assault on urban centers, the human rights abuses, the potential war crimes, the atrocities that we have great concern could take place. These are all things that we want to prevent. So you asked the question, why would we engage in diplomacy? Well, we would engage in diplomacy to save lives. We would engage in diplomacy to prevent an all-out war. This is a war that would be brutal, it would be costly, it would be, in many ways, devastating for the Russian Federation, of course, for the Ukrainian people, and the way in which the Russian Federation would wage this war, you heard from the National Security Advisor, it would not be a type of conflict that you might imagine over territory or over concrete ends. You heard the National Security Advisor make the case that this would be a war waged against the Ukrainian people to subjugate them, to crush them, to exact, in many ways, revenge. This is what we want to prevent. So we are ready to engage, but we need a partner. We need a negotiating counterpart that demonstrates seriousness of purpose. We have not seen that from the Russian Federation. In fact, we have seen the opposite at every turn.